Hi, my name is Kuhn Verbruggen. I'm the Director of Geological Survey Ireland, and it's my pleasure to be able to chair the final session for what's been a very, very busy and very, very informative CHERISH conference, and I'm sure you'll agree. Geological Survey are one of the project partners, as you've probably picked up, and our involvement has been, as outlined by Kieran Craven in his presentation, focused on a lot of the marine mapping and coastal mapping. And it's really been a great project to be involved in, and has exceeded our expectations in terms of what we've got out of it, irrespective of everything else. So, like I said, in this final session, we have three speakers who are going to give a broader view, a wider view. You've had a lot of detail already, so this might be a chance to look at some of the bigger pictures. And our first speaker is Will Megarry from Queen's University Belfast. And each of the speakers have presentations and slides. So I'll invite Will to share his presentation with us now.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeev Gochdina. Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Allow me to start just by thanking the organisers for inviting me to take part in this discussion. While I may only be joining you from up the road, I would like to speak to you today in my capacity as a Bureau member of the ICOMOS Working Group on Climate Change and Cultural Heritage, and also reflect some of the wider work done by the Climate Heritage Network, of which QUB and myself are members. And it's wonderful to see so many CHN members here today, including two of our international steering group who've both been speaking. Many of you will be familiar with the work of the ICOMOS Working Group, which draws its membership from 6 continents and from across the heritage sector, including architects, archaeologists, planners, museum curators, and even some policymakers. In 2019, we published the Futures of Our Past report, a high-level outline of climate change and cultural heritage, and have continued to work on a range of projects, including developing new tools for vulnerability assessment and working on updates to World Heritage policy. The theme of this discussion, to make heritage central to decision-making and policy, is both very important and timely for a range of reasons. This year has seen an exciting acknowledgement of the role of culture in the climate crisis, including the launch of the recent European Cultural Heritage Green Paper entitled Putting Europe's Shared Heritage at the Heart of the European New Deal, which was produced by Europa Nostra, and the first ever meeting of Ministers of Culture to discuss the topic at the G20 in Italy in the 29th and 30th of July. This year will also see the United Kingdom hosting the United Nations Conference of Parties, or COP, in Glasgow in November. And I'm sure that many of us here have been involved in trying to organise events and mainline cultural heritage matters into discussion frameworks and agendas at the event. At the heart of this efforts lie a fundamental question. In a world facing a climate catastrophe where climate migration and conflict and ecosystem collapse are no longer just predictions, why is culture and cultural heritage actually important? While there are many relevant topics in this broader conversation, I would like to try and address this question, which I believe lies at the heart of the wider issues surrounding policy and decision-making. And I also think it's a useful starting point for our wider discussion today. I would like to propose that cultural heritage places allow us to address many of the issues central to the climate crisis in a human-focused and place-based manner, which can cut through the often terse scientific terminology and stress urgency, encouraging community engagement and inspiring climate action. The climate crisis is the most significant threat facing humanity, yet politicians, those in the climate science sector, including many heritage professionals, have failed to adequately stress this urgency to the public. Part of this dynamic is that science can be overwhelming, and people can very quickly get lost in a forest of scientific terms, p-values, statistics, and emission scenarios, and lose sight of the personal and emotional cost of climate impacts. An example of this was recently observed with the Australian wildfires in early 2020. While IPCC reports foresaw these as long ago as 2007, noting a potential 25% increase by the year they occurred in 2020, there was little popular response until the cost of fires to people's lives and the natural heritage of the region was so graphically captured on camera. These reports humanized the conversation and made it people-centered. Similarly, culture and heritage are about people and things which are important to people. Closer to home, and an example we've seen some of today already, and from a coastal perspective as well, we saw a similar response while much of Doondag was lost to erosion and storminess. This event brought the issue of coastal erosion and loss to public attention, and the response was emphatic in calling for action and response. More iconic sites like Venice, increasing floodwaters are threatening not just, so we talked about this. In fact, coastal and island communities are uniquely impacted by climate change across the globe. From Hoi An in Vietnam to St. Louis in Senegal, threats to coastal heritage are often featured in narratives of community and heritage loss. While this heritage is often focused on loss, it is important to stress that heritage plays a unique role in encouraging resilience. All over the world, coastal and island communities have mobilized to respond and adapt to the loss. They've done this because these places matter to them. They are more than just homes to live in. They are anchor points for communities and receptacles containing cultural memory and traditions. And the geographies and range and coastal sites illustrate the global nature of both impacts and responses. And this aligns with wider ambition, including the targets of the Paris Agreement for collective action. There is no wall big enough to protect our coastal heritage, and eventually Venice, Hoi An, St. Louis and Rapa Nui will all be lost unless there is global action to reduce emissions. This message lies at the heart of global action, and heritage can play a central role in its communication. And make no mistake, politicians and government are aware of this communicative power of culture and are keen to exploit it. Much of the narrative within COP circles have focused on historical narratives, specifically the British role within the Industrial Revolution and their desire to lead the way in responding to the climate crisis. They remind us that climate change is a result of culture and that culture has a role to play in addressing it. This range of different narratives reflects the entanglement of culture in all our lives and was reflected in the Future of Our Past report, which stressed the value of culture as a communications asset. That culture is woven in every part of the human experience gives it endless opportunities to engage on key climate themes. To demonstrate this, I would like to conclude by focusing on recent efforts by many in the ICOMOS community and wider communities to engage with the COP in Glasgow in November. In most of the key COP themes which are listed on the screen, we can see a clear intersection with heritage. Partners and members of ICOMOS and others have suggested a range of events from themes, including retrofitting historic buildings for carbon efficiency, for the energy themes, and looking at breaking down the culture-nature divide in the nature theme. Perhaps the most immediately relevant theme for cultural heritage is adaptation and resilience, and there is already a strong anchor point upon which culture can build. Article 7.5 of the Paris Agreement encourages engagement with culture, stressing that climate actions should be based on and guided by the best available science, as appropriate traditional knowledge, knowledge of indigenous peoples and local knowledge systems, with a view to integrating adaptation into relevant socio-economic and environmental policies and actions where appropriate. In this theme, several initiatives have been proposed at various levels of governance in both the official blue zones with state party representatives and in less official green zones with NGOs and civil partner organisations. Cultural narratives fit perfectly into initiatives like the Race for Zero or the Race for Resilience, which promotes adaptation globally. Efforts also included applications to utilise multimedia facilities, including presenting 3D models, data and video from the 2020 Google Arts and Culture funded Heritage on the Edge project in the COP IMAX cinema. While decisions on these applications are pending, a range of events and approaches illustrate the multifaceted way that the heritage sector can engage with policymakers on a global stage. So in conclusion, heritage as the cumulative memory of humankind and the memory of communities as something which anchors us in place. It is something from which we derive our identity and it gives us a grounding in the world. Without it, people lack that anchoring and lose that sense of community. It is the glue that holds us together, and it is also a powerful tool to help us respond to the climate emergency and, when utilised effectively, a driver for climate ambition and action globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Will. Excellent presentation. Now we'll move to Virginia Teehan, and Virginia is the CEO of the Heritage Council. So Virginia, if you'd like to join us and share your slides as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and a very warm expression of gratitude on my part for the very kind invitation to speak to this conference this afternoon. We are intimately connected with the CHERISH project through the Discovery programme. It's a very significant programme, and the Heritage Council is very privileged to be closely connected with Discovery programme, and I'd like to commend John O'Keefe and the team at Discovery Programme for their wonderful work. I've been asked to talk to you today about our work. We are a policy advisory agency, and our work in terms of how we work with those who are dealing with climate change issues and the Heritage Council's responses to climate change, and in particular our views around how that impacts heritage in Ireland within the policy context. And in my discussion today, I'm looking at 6 main points, and that is around whether or not heritage is correctly represented, I suppose, at a national level, also adaptation policies, research, awareness raising, training and resource management. And I think just from my own review of national policy, and most particularly the most recent Climate Action Advisory Plan, if you evaluate that document, there are simply 4 mentions of heritage out of a total of 150 pages. And this for me raises a lot of questions about whether or not heritage is considered to be significant or relevant, and also about whether or not the heritage sector or the heritage community has been vocal in advocating for the role of heritage and its significance in the discussions and narrative around climate action. I think the heritage sector, and indeed colleagues who attended the conference today, certainly have been vocal, but how effective our voices are, I think, is a question that we must ask. And it's a particular question that the Heritage Council feels it needs to address. Also looking at more specific documents which relate to coastal heritage, harnessing our ocean wealth, the Integrated Maritime Plan for Ireland. Again, the work that many people in this conference are engaged with, the work around the protection of our coastal landscapes, our historic landscapes, and how climate change impacts those places. It's not always clear either in this document whether or not our concerns are centre stage. I also feel very strongly, and this is something that we are supporting through our work with heritage officers, those are employed by local authorities all across the country, that heritage is key to the wider suite of policies currently being developed by local authorities. And it was great to see the Heritage Division from the Department of Housing, Heritage and Local Government publish recently their adaptation plan. And we certainly actively support the inclusion of heritage and heritage provision in the broad sense in these plans. Internally here at the Council, we note that while there is a lot of focus on biodiversity, and quite rightly so, and this month we'll mark Biodiversity Week later on in May, we are also concerned, and I suppose it's something that concerns me, that cultural heritage is also considered. My own personal professional background is from a cultural heritage space. I'm a qualified archivist, and I spent a lot of my professional career working in the museum sector. And the Heritage Council works very widely with communities, social enterprises and NGOs. And it is our experience and my own experience that communities, social enterprises, businesses and local networks are the key catalysts for supporting awareness of the impacts of climate change and also putting in place steps to mitigate against the negative impacts. And looking specifically at adaptation policies, it's my view that there needs to be an increased engagement in the development of policies with those who have responsibilities for the natural, built and cultural heritage, and particularly those who are the owners of private heritage. Over 50% of heritage assets in Ireland is in private ownership, and we need to work very closely with farmers, with building owners, and with other stewards of our heritage to support and enable them to adapt in light of the current changes. We also need to be aware and sensitive to the impacts on our very sensitive habitats and to anticipate in advance, and I know everybody in this call is aware of this, but the likely impacts of climate change and changes in farming methods and the use and management of land, and mitigate against the impacts for wildlife. Landscape permeability and the connections between habitats, landscape and land use, as I've just mentioned, particularly around low-lying coasts. Increased integration and understanding of the connectivity between all the players on this pitch is important. In an environment of increased climate change, as Will, the last speaker, has referenced in his paper, the built heritage requires greater levels of inspection, monitoring and maintenance. And I know this myself personally, and I'll reference it later in my short paper. Those of us who work with the care of a built heritage site, I mean, I'm sitting in one here this afternoon where I'm from the Heritage Council's headquarters in Kilkenny. We need to up our game in emergency response planning and to anticipate the impact of storms and flooding. And specifically for the coast and for those of us concerned with the impact of climate change on heritage assets located in more vulnerable areas, I think we're reaching a stage where we need to begin to decide whether or not we must accept certain losses to cultural heritage and put in place strategies that manage these decisions and allow for the retreat of our cultural heritage by recording possible loss, or perhaps develop policies around the relocation of heritage assets away from vulnerable and threatened sites. I know during today's conference a lot of reference has been made to research, and at the Heritage Council we too are very aware of the need for increased research to inform ourselves around policy development areas. In particular, I think we need much more precise baseline knowledge to monitor right across the country the impacts of climate change on heritage. Colleagues on this call, I know, for example, the Geological Survey, Transport Infrastructure Ireland, NPWS and others are doing significant work in this area. We're doing work ourselves through the National Biodiversity Data Centre, one of our major projects, but we need to grow and increase this work and upskill researchers and encourage third level institutions to create more graduates who will work in this area. I was interested to see in the past few days there are much more increased number of students in the CEO system applying for courses in environmental areas, and I think that's important. We need to upskill our knowledge, and we need to prioritise investigations of sites of particular vulnerability, particularly those located in coastal areas. An area that we have to watch in our work with the Heritage Council, we work closely in some projects with Fáilte Ireland, and the impact of tourism and the impact of increased economic activity in heritage sites is a possible area of vulnerability. Being proactive and developing strategies which anticipate issues in advance and allow the development of mitigation strategies is an important area of work, and something where we in Ireland and in the British Isles, we can learn a lot from colleagues in Australia, Canada and in other countries. I think we also need to look at the research into public attitudes and awareness, whether or not people are really fully aware of the impact of climate change, how it will impact their place, the heritage of the place, and whether or not social activity or economic activities and increased tourism in rural and vulnerable areas, which are maybe not prepared for the volume of tourists and the impact they will have, requires further investigation. In particularly vulnerability mapping, and I know this is happening, we recommend and encourage that this is supported and developed to allow much more precise scientific knowledge to be collated and therefore to be used in the development of policy. I mentioned earlier awareness raising, and this is something that we're very aware of, and we wish to increase our work in this area, to work with the public. There is a very willing public, particularly in the younger demographic, who have a deep interest in the impact of climate change, and we need to work with them to develop better understandings of the need to protect vulnerable areas. We also need, I think, to understand the impact of the mitigation measures that are required to deal with excessive storms and floodings, and to have much more public consultation around how these essential pieces of work may impact, and indeed negatively impact, other areas of heritage, such as our landscape and our cultural heritage. I think we must enable and support communities and social enterprises to be increasingly aware of the value of place and the vulnerabilities of place. And in particular, I use an example of the Megarry Conservation Group. It's a group we have worked with in County Kerry, who have developed very specific programs around the protection of their very beautiful but sometimes very vulnerable coastline, and developed that program in a holistic heritage area where they're looking at the science and also the history and the cultural heritage of their place in many different programs. The Burren Bureau program is another important project that the Heritage Council works with very closely and provides a lot of financial support. We also need to raise awareness amongst the tourism providers and policymakers so that they're aware of the implications of decisions that they make, and how their businesses and how the wider economy may be impacted by climate change, and how they should anticipate the changes for their businesses and their localities. We also believe that training, and this is something we're talking to third level institutes about, is essential for those involved in heritage. We feel that all training in heritage studies, museum studies, archival studies, and other heritage-specific disciplines, archaeology, disciplines in the built heritage, must also embrace climate management and climate change issues in all aspects of training. We feel that existing heritage managers and other professionals require additional training, and the Heritage Council has engaged in a number of continuous professional development programs aimed at particular groups such as architects and archaeologists, and we will continue to do that. We've also worked in recent years with the museum sector in particular to help them in developing emergency preparedness in coping with the extreme weather conditions and being aware of the impact on heritage sites. And we do indeed provide funding to help agencies, particularly those outside the state sector, to prepare themselves for emergencies which inevitably will arise. But all of this requires resourcing, and we are aware of the resource requirements, and we think that in our next budget submissions and our next strategic planning, we certainly will be advocating for increased resources at a national level to ensure that heritage is more fully integrated into national planning, and that leadership acknowledges the significance of mitigation against the loss of heritage assets, and how that this can have a very important impact on budgetary costs when dealing with the results of significant climate disasters, and how these can be very expensive when an organisation or society is faced with the costs of repair. And the costs, as I say in my third bullet point there, of protecting sites must always be valued and placed against our ability to carry out the work and indeed the heritage value of the sites within our care. We also need to be very clear about being strategic and focused and to prioritise what needs to be cared for, those most vulnerable sites, and recognise that sometimes there will need to be trade-offs. And we find this in our dialogue with those who are charged with the responsibility of protecting heritage assets. And I know this myself from my own work in the museum world, in developing emergency plans and in anticipating situations where decisions have to be made at a pressurised time. There are always trade-offs to be made on what to protect and conserve and what to let go. And this must be based upon high-quality information, the significance of the heritage resource and the value of heritage to the community in which it is placed. And in order to bring these points to life, I mean, these are some slides that I sometimes use in discussions with partners in government and with other decision makers. In one of my previous roles, I was involved as a director of the Glucksman Gallery at University College Cork. In fact, I was very involved with the development of the Glucksman Gallery as part of the design team and its inception many years ago. It is a very significant building, architecturally nominated for the Sterling Prize, and it houses a significant collection of contemporary artworks. In 2009, Cork was subject to a major flood, which flooded all the area around the western boundaries of the city and penetrated right through into the city centre. The university campus and the Glucksman, and you see the footprint of the gallery there, an aerial view, was completely flooded. And I am also trained as a paper conservator, was part of the team brought in to help with the rescue operation. And I have some photographs there of one of the stores that we were confronted when we went in to the building some days after the flood. And that's a photograph of two conservators there working on the protection of a print which was rescued from the store. And you see surrounding you there some of the frames. We had to remove works from the walls. We were dealing with 8 to 15 metres of water in some cases. And once the building was pumped out, there was significant water damage to 3/4 of the collection. Very significant damage, but great work was done in rescuing most of the works. And that's after the rescue work was completed. We were working for about 14 months. I oversaw a team of conservators. President McAleese came to visit the building once it was reopened to the public, and there she is with the conservation team, acknowledging the really heroic work that was done in the protection of some significant parts of our cultural heritage. And I think the acknowledgement by the President of the role of heritage professionals meant a lot to us, and it sent out a very important signal to the heritage community and indeed to the public of the real risk that climate change poses to heritage. And it was a step and is a step in raising awareness about the importance of us making provision for the protection of our heritage and of heritage being centre stage in all discourse around policies for climate change. I also feel globally there is a much greater awareness of the impact and the potential damage that climate change will have. And I just finished my short words today by displaying a video. I'm not sure if the sounds will come out on this video, which is an artwork prepared by a French artist, Teehan Gabouni, and it reflects the impact of the flooding, a possible flooding in the Louvre. And it's a collection of 17th century Dutch masterpiece paintings. And you will see in the video the rising tide waters as the paintings will inevitably be completely damaged by the water. And if, like me, and I think most people who are qualified as either museum curators or archivists or conservators, at some stage in your life, you find yourself in a disaster. situation and you find yourself in the middle of a rescue operation and your heart sinks and it stops. And this artwork, in a way, captures the appalling vista that is so scary when you're in the place and you just see the damage of climate change on our irreparable heritage. So I'll finish with this video and thank you in advance for your attention.
Thank you very much, Virginia. It's a bit scary. um, Plenty of food for thought there as well, though. And I suppose makes a change from watching a dune bag falling into the sea. Our final speaker in this session is Tom Dawson. Tom Dawson's with University of St Andrew and the SCAPE group, and he's going to fill us in. Tom, thank you. You might share your slides.
Hi there. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you fine, yeah. Do you want to share your slides?
And can you see the slides? Can you see that?
Yeah, we can see all that. That's right.
Okay, right. Hi there. Yep, I'm Tom, and I live up in Scotland. But this is a story. I was asked to talk about why working with communities is important. And so this is me when I was a kid. And my parents moved around quite a lot. So I lived in England, I lived in Wales, and we went up to Scotland. And I used to live in this village just by the Broch of Bursay. And the bus into school every day used to stop here. And in the evenings, we'd go and play in the passageways in this place. But this isn't why I became an archaeologist. As any kid, I kind of took this for granted. I thought that everybody had a site of significance in their backyard. And it was only when I went down to Aylesbury in Buckinghamshire and I found this bottle that I really became sort of fixed on and hooked on heritage. And this was partly because it had a picture of the clock tower on it. And by this stage, I'd sort of given up with school. I had no interest in going on to university, but I did have a great deal of interest in sitting on the steps underneath Aylesbury's clock tower. And then the Bucks Herald newspaper ran a story and it said, Anglo-Saxon skeletons found in town centre, but it had a picture of a sheep skeleton on it. So I marched down to the archaeological site to go and tell the archaeologists that they were wrong. But instead of giving me a clip around the ear and telling me to sling my hook, they gave me a pickaxe and said, would you like to join in? And after a few days knocking down walls, I became an integrated part of the team and I spent the whole summer there. And they encouraged me and they enthused me and they gave me responsibilities like holding the ranging rod. And over the summer, I saw this site unfold. I saw an urban excavation from start to end, and I was completely and utterly gripped. So I went off to university and I studied archaeology. And every summer I'd go back and I'd volunteer with Bucks County Council, and that's me in the orange just there. And after I graduated, I got a job in London. And after a few years, I was made a supervisor on this site. And at the time, this was the most expensive excavation that had ever taken place in Europe. It was the Fleet Valley. But we had these great big hoardings up and we weren't allowing the public to see what we were finding. I managed to sneak my mum onto site one day, and this is just a tiny, tiny portion of the excavation. It went on, and we had the Fleet Prison there. We had Blackfriars, and in this picture here, you can see me admiring part of the medieval wall of the old city of London. But I always felt there was something wrong, that we really should be getting people more involved in this heritage, especially as many of the things that we were finding were going to be destroyed and never seen again. After London, I went on to this site, which was Elms Farm in Essex, and I was a supervisor here. You can see me inside the site hut. While there, I was given some responsibility for bringing volunteers in, and this was great. We were able to get a few people in here. And if you look carefully, actually, just below me there, you will see one Dr. Toby Driver. So after Elms Farm, I spent 3.5 years in Sri Lanka working with voluntary service overseas as a volunteer, working on archaeological sites over there. Then came back and got a job in Scotland where I set up SCAPE, Scottish Coastal Archaeology and the Problem of Erosion. And I inherited this project, Shore Watch. This is something that Historic Environment, well, it was called Historic Scotland then, that Historic Scotland had set up. And this was asking the public to go out there and locate, monitor and record eroding sites. And this was great. This really was what I wanted to do. I could see the absolute benefits in doing this. And this was 20 years ago. We started doing this work with the communities. And then after a few years, Joe came up and joined, and we started talking about things. And we'd been very enthused by the Thames Archaeological Surveys project, which then turned into the Thames Discovery Programme. And also we had the inspirational Lincolnshire Heritage at Risk to draw on. And we used these ideas and looked at how people there have been working with the public. And we came up with this one, Scotland's Coastal Heritage at Risk. And so back in 2012, we were joined by Ellie and joined by Tanya, and we set up SHARP. And this had two elements to it. The first part was the shore update. And we're all very familiar now with this. We've been hearing a lot about this through the day of people using these apps. But right back in 2012, we set up this app. And I must say that we have got a new app, which we're just about to release. I haven't got time to talk about it now, but it is very exciting. And if you want to know about that, contact me afterwards, because we are hoping to be able to make this so we can share this app with other people in other places. We also had a second strand to the SHARP project, which was ShoreDig. And this is where we asked communities to nominate locally valued sites, places that were at risk from erosion and where they wanted to do some work. And we discussed possibilities with them, and they came up with plans, and then we helped them to do this. And the important aspect here is these were really their projects. It was their ideas, and we were just helping them we were facilitating these projects. And it wasn't just excavations, it was making films, it was making 3D models, it was surveys and all sorts of different stuff. And we carried on doing that from 2012 up until the present, really. We're still doing this sort of thing. And Joe, using all that experience, has sort of made this recipe of what it is that makes an effective community engagement project. So you get all of those things and mix them up. So going back to the beginning of this talk, why is it that we should be working with the public? Well, obviously for myself, as someone who was inspired as a young person, I really think it's important to get out there and try and talk to young people. These are the stewards of the future. These are the people who are going to take responsibility for the heritage after we're long gone. Working with the public means that people get to try new things. They can develop new skills and do things that maybe they wouldn't otherwise have had a chance to do. But also we have this whole teamwork and working together in order to reach this common goal, to try and save these sites before they're lost to erosion and coastal processes. And so over the years, we've seen communities coming up with all sorts of different ways to record their sites and striving to actually do something, including making these films which they can show to other people, and the oral history projects where people come down and share their information. So we do have this real knowledge exchange going on. And the partnerships also extend to other organisations. So here we see the Adopt a Monument project. And here's Helen, who now works in Wales, talking to a group up in Shetland. And of course, we've got all the other partners. We've seen many of these people today. Hi, Sarah. And also I should be saying hi, Elias and Maria Van and Ann Jensen as well. I couldn't find your logo, so I couldn't stick you onto this little thing. But it's very important, these partnerships, because we all talk to each other and we share ideas, and in this way we're able to develop new ways of working, which is so important. And also the information that the communities bring in is absolutely vital. You know, this is fantastic stuff. Sorry, I'm going to be talking about that in a minute. It's the cascading of the information. It's the communities are in there, their friends and their families come down and they visit the sites and they talk about new discoveries, but they also talk about climate change and the way that climate change is affecting the heritage. And it gives the communities a chance to interpret the heritage and tell everybody about the stuff they've found, make interpretation boards and put things into their heritage centres. Having fun is absolutely crucial. I don't know whether he's having fun, but this was at the top of Joe's list, as you can see. So if people aren't enjoying working with you, they're probably not going to come back again. So just make sure that everybody has fun, but they also have this sense of purpose. And it's this, I'm now getting onto it, this providing this crucial information. The information that the heritage groups provide is absolutely fantastic. So here we have a group up in Channelwick in Shetland. They found this site after a storm. And after cleaning up the section and getting the dating evidence, we realized that what was here was in fact a previously unrecorded broch. I mean, who would think that you'd be able to find an unrecorded broch in this day and age? And we've been working very closely also with this. This is a Scottish government project, and the information that we provide is going in and it's helping to plan how, to make plans for how to manage coastal change in the future. And then finally, by working with the public, we also get a chance quite often to talk to our politicians and to the people who make the political decisions. And here we see our Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs, Fiona Hislop, together with David Torrance, visiting the group down in East Weems and discussing climate change and the way that that's affecting the sites down there. And our former Minister for the Environment and Climate Change, Paul Wheelhouse, is here hosting an event in the Scottish Parliament for the IMouth group. So that was a very rapid run through for why I think working with communities is very important. And I want to emphasize that I think that what CHERISH is doing in this respect is crucial as well. They've started on this road and they're doing it. And I think that we should all be doing this. We should all be working with communities as much as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tom. That was very energetic, very good. Great to see how well you looked there as well. The days before you had to wear high-vis on a building site, obviously. What I might do, I might get everyone to flick on their cameras now, and we can get to the discussion part. That's great. Before we go into those questions about your own talks, we've got a couple of questions from the audience, so live questions. And one of them is very, very straightforward, very practical, but very challenging. It's just, would it be practical to move to Doonbeg Fort to the Blasket Centre a few miles away? It's owned by the OPW. It's better than let it to fall in the sea. There'd be great interest in such a move. So this is kind of where the rubber meets the road, or the archaeological feature meets the cliff. But this is exactly the point. So maybe Will, if I come to you first on this, how do we make these decisions about, you know, what do we let fall into the sea? What do we move?
It's a really, really good question. And I think that one of the key things about climate change and our response to it has to be high ambition. So I think we need to ask these huge questions. And we've heard a lot in the talks today about this idea of triaging sites, about the idea that we're going to lose some. And maybe as an archaeologist by training, I feel a bit more comfortable with that idea than other people do, because so much of what we do involves recording and preservation by record. And I think that's what's so it's important. So how do we decide? Well, I mean, I think that another thing that's come up a couple of times in talks I've been at today is this idea of value, right? And we've heard talk of the archaeological value, and Tom just very eloquently there and passionately talked about the kind of community and personal values which these places have. And I think that's how we need to start making these decisions, is to take a wider understanding of the values of these sites, not just as heritage assets, but also to within their wider opinions and within their wider communities. And I also think a part of that, and a part of what we're just going to have to do because of the size and the scale of the climate catastrophe which we're facing, is challenge our traditional ideas of authenticity, which have been very much built in a kind of conservationist mode about physical authenticity. But I think in other parts of the world, and a big part of heritage dialogue over the last few decades has been about what defines authenticity. How much of that is the preservation of something perfectly in situ versus the values that are associated with. So I've done a politician's answer there, and I haven't directly answered the question, but I might try out some ideas and see what my other panelists think.
Yeah, well, it isn't. There isn't a simple answer to it. And I know I've been to Warsaw, and I saw the reconstruction of Warsaw, which is kind of Disney-esque in some ways, and yet it's very valuable. It lets you see what it was like. So that is the question. My friends of mine who are OPW engineers would be horrified now to thought having to move Doonbeg to the Blasket Centre, but there you go. Might give them something to do. Virginia, you mentioned as well, it ties into this, but the importance of sort of raising the profile. It was interesting. 2 documents I'm very familiar with: Harnessing Our Ocean Wealth and the Climate Action Plan, the latter which was produced by our department, and I had a hell of a job trying to elbow any geology into it, God knows. But this point, and it's sort of tied to a second public question we've got about how do you about raising the profile of the historic environment in the climate change discussions. I mean, you said you need to do that. Well, how are you going to do that? Maybe it's part of your job. So, yeah.
Well, I mean, it's a byproduct of our job, I suppose. More, I mean, our job is around policy advice and policy recommendation, but you can't do that without being informed by communities. And, you know, I thought the last question was brilliant. It really forces a discussion about Doonbeg. And in my view, that discussion starts with the community in Kerry and the Irish community and their feelings around Doonbeg. And it's only when there's a crisis that sometimes the value of heritage and history becomes really apparent, or if something is threatened to be moved or installed, that the public react. But, you know, I think also Tom's presentation was really powerful in demonstrating the significance of the local and the local voice in discussion. And the awareness, I think, starts with one. It starts with the one person. It starts with the younger people. And the younger people in the past 2 years, their protests around climate change have had a dynamic impact on policy and on shift in perceptions around policy. So I think that's one place where we would focus our attention on raising awareness. And the other place is at the senior level, is at the level of, I showed the image of President McAleese visiting the conservators, but also engaging with, in our country, with the Taoiseach and with the senior ministers. And it is wonderful that we now have a minister with dedicated responsibility for heritage, Minister Noonan. And you know, it's not accidental that because we have a Minister for Heritage, for example, our budget has increased by 45% in 1 year. And I think the funding for heritage and heritage at all levels has increased significantly. So that level of attention and acknowledgement of the importance of heritage at the most senior leadership levels is vital. The Heritage Council has a part to play in that, as do many other agencies and bodies. But we are informed and sometimes led by the voice of the communities on the ground about their decisions around what is important.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, very good. And Tom, it's very, very well illustrated there about the kids and, you know, like your own story with the kids being involved. But, you know, that bit about the politicians coming in and being able to talk to them. And I guess something, you know, something, I suppose, looking at Cherish, we're getting incredible, almost micro detail on specific sites. And you know, we've just a rich data set. But then, you know, trying to scale that up, it's not feasible to scale that up to capture everything to that level. So, and also this question of having that information at the micro level then, but needing to try to inform things at the macro and at the policy level. So how, within all the Scottish endeavours, which seem really impressive, how have you managed to try to make that link? And then also the question on the local is, and for my sins, I'm involved in my own local community, like, everybody loves their local heritage, and their local heritage is the most important heritage to them. You know, the local church will be more important than the Eiffel Tower or the pyramids, let's be honest, to the locality. So how are you getting on with sort of, sorry, it's a hard question, but there's two parts to that, going from the micro to the macro and going from the local to the kind of national. How do you tackle that?
Okay, so in Scotland, we were quite lucky that right back in the mid-1990s, Historic Scotland started a series of coastal surveys following the example from Wales. So Wales has had all theirs done, England have had theirs done. We took over those surveys, and then we spent some time prioritizing sites. So rather than just collecting the information, we put a stop on the collecting the information. We took the 12,500 records that we'd already collected and went through and did a fairly simple but quick and dirty form of prioritization, which was a little bit like the example that we saw earlier from Denmark, where they looked at coastal proximity. But it was more than just proximity. It was elevation. It was erosion type of the coast. So it was looking at the vulnerability of the site, but also an idea of the value of the site, combining the two, and then coming up with a priority list. And we ended up with 1,000 odd sites from the 12,500, which we thought were of high priority. And then throwing that out to the public and saying, okay, from this 1,000 sites, which ones would you like to work on? And seeing which ones the community, because there's enough to go around then. One of the reasons we did this was I gave a talk many, many years ago to the head of Historic Scotland, as was at the time, and I was doing this doom and gloom and kind of, oh my God, we'll never be able to deal with it all. And he just turned around and said, why are you being so negative? We can do something. We just have to find a way of doing it. And it really changed me, and it made me think, yes, we need to be more positive about this. Instead of just thinking that this is an impossible problem, it's going to keep getting worse and worse, we have to chip away, work with as many different people that we can. And so by making that big list and then passing out to the communities and then saying to you, well, you've got 15 sites that may be at risk in your area, which one are you going to choose? And getting them to then make that decision also actually makes it a bit easier for them to lose other ones, because they've actually had to go through the decision process and say, okay, I as a community member value this site more than this site. So yeah, I understand we're going to lose this one, but we will keep this one.
Yeah, and I suppose the key thing there, and it's the point Virginia made as well about vulnerability, being able to assess vulnerability. So you're going to need two key data sets. You need to know how the coast is changing, so which of them are at risk, and then you need to know all of your heritage assets, as you say, at least an outline of them. But the idea of being able to push it back down and let the community decide almost what to do. And I have to say, as a geologist, getting into this project from the start, I was kind of pleasantly surprised that the archaeologists didn't seem that bothered about things falling into the sea, as long as they could to get all the information. There was a misconception I had, so I take that all back. I know that now.
Well, it's as Will said, it's because we're used. This is what we do every time someone builds a supermarket. The archaeological site gets destroyed, so we're used to that. It's just the only problem is that there is no developer to pay for the work, and this is probably one of the biggest problems that we have is who's going to pay for the work that needs to be.
Yeah, and then if I come on to the profile raising, Will, you mentioned at the end COP21, and it was interesting you mentioned IMAX. So it really is a question of taking the opportunity, but wanted to raise the profile and to communicate. And I suppose one of the things I really like today, and I've liked about the CHERISH project, is the efforts they've made in communications. I absolutely love those cartoons, particularly when they were animated today. I was worried the little GPR person was going to go off the end of the cliff, but so is that really key then to be able to communicate it, to be able to get the message and around COP even?
I think so, obviously. And we worked over the last few years on a project with ICOMOS called Heritage on the Edge, which looked at this from a kind of place-based storytelling perspective. And the responses we got from that were incredibly positive. And I think a lot, and Virginia touched on this as well, I think a lot of it comes down to carbon literacy, right? So archaeologists need to understand the dynamics and the science behind climate change better. And as Virginia said, that's a responsibility for universities. But I think that people in climate science and policy need to understand the role of heritage better, and that's where we need to take every single opportunity we can to jump in there and talk about it. One of the things we're doing in Queen's, and so kind of Will the lecturer hat on, is we're instigating accredited climate literacy for all 300 of our school students, and that includes civil engineers, architects, everything. Starting in September, every first year will have to do 3 days of course on climate literacy, because once it's mainlined into the programs and into the syllabuses, then this just becomes a natural thing to do, right? Is to think about everything in the context of climate and I mean, whereas I totally agree on the CHERISH stuff. Like, their graphics are just foul. I use them in lectures and things all the time, fully credited. But it's absolutely, you're absolutely correct. The power of heritage to communicate these things is immense, and we need to be doing more of it, and we need to be taking every opportunity when something's out for consultation to jump on it and put a comment in on heritage, and when there's a lecture, there's a conference on and something else, to be going in and asking a question about heritage, because that's how we mainline it. That's how we bring it in.
Yeah, wedging it in. And Virginia, coming to you about getting, like I say, getting references in those key documents, is that really part of the key role? Then is when these consultations are out there, as Will says, even if they're not in seemingly in your area, to make them aware of it, to be able to add the heritage piece, add the heritage comment to consultations. Is that one of the key?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one step, but I think there are more, wider steps. We need other advocates to speak for us. I think the communication techniques and the methods, using new technologies like animations, which were used earlier today, and other ways of communicating. And remembering that, the public may not be fully literate around the technical details of heritage protection and the asset itself, but they have a strong emotional connection, and getting their buy-in to be supportive is really very valuable, particularly within a Republic of Ireland context where elected representatives are always, interested in what their constituents value.
Yeah,
and that is important. I'd certainly observed that in our work, say, for example, in our various programmes, our grant schemes, our Adopt a Monument programme in Ireland, the elected representatives from the areas in which the sites are situated are always interested in what's in their constituency. So there is that, whether we like it or not, there is that strong connection between the political and the priorities that reach government policy, and that's why having a minister, even albeit a junior minister, dedicated to heritage is very important. And it's important even for current CAP negotiations that heritage is part of the dialogue.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We have some more questions in on this, and one of them is on one is about making the point that through the Ocean Decade Heritage Network, they're making the case for cultural heritage in the UN Ocean Decade, which is 21 to 30. And what do you think we should focus on to raise awareness of coastal heritage among scientists and policymakers in achieving a sustainable future? So it's a tough question in raising the awareness of coastal heritage. Well, I suppose if I can try and answer it, I mean, as you said, Virginia, it's making the local connections, but you do need the evidence, you do need the information, and as you say, the graphics and the communication tools are based on being able to acquire some good information. And the question Tom said about the cost of it, it's being able to scale up these examples.
Could I just make one other observation? I think the positive is important. I know we're running very much out of time now, but Tom's point is very well made. If you get people, particularly policymakers, coming to you with the negative all the time, it's not helpful. Focusing on the positive and ending on the high note is really valuable in getting your voice heard.
Yeah, exactly. And I suppose so much of the climate change discussion has been quite depressing. I read that The Uninhabitable Earth book. I needed therapy after it, but there were a lot of very good facts, and I can give him his due. John Sweeney in his keynote address, there were some hard facts in that, but at least he's putting forward the real figures. I mean, the one sticking with me is the numeric, the actual euro cost we're putting on an acre of agricultural, preserving an acre of agricultural land versus having to build a seawall to protect it, 20,000 versus 10 million. So that's with our own Department of Finance, we know how that's going to end. As you say, we're running tight on time. I don't know, Will, I'll give each as one last sentence if you want to chip something in. No pressure.
No, just to follow up on that idea about good news stories. There's so many of them to do with heritage. A little bit off topic, but people would have seen yesterday that the Empire State Buildings had a green retrofit. What a brilliant use of built heritage to make a point about what every building can do. Right? It's an incredible story, and we need to be looking at those and talking about those as well.
And Tom, if you to leave us with a sentence.
I say, yeah, I would say just stay positive, go out there and get involved. If anybody gives you the opportunity, get involved. And it's up to us as people running these projects. We have to give people the chance to work on these sites, because if the option is they're going to fall into the sea, or you get communities working on them, then get the communities working on them.
Exactly. And Virginia?
Just like to say to everyone on the call, particularly the CHERISH people, keep up the good work. We admire it from a distance, and thanks.
Yeah, that's a perfect segue for me. Before I hand back, I should actually, because Sarah is part of the project team who's going to wrap up, and on behalf of all of us at the conference, and on behalf of myself and the GSI, to really hats off to the team, not just for the conference they pulled off today, but for the work they're doing. It's delivered above and beyond what we were looking for in GSI. We've been involved, but I was pretty happy with it from the start. When you get involved in a project and the 4 project partners all know what they're doing at the start, it's always a good sign, and it's so it has proved. So with that, to my panelists, thank you very, very much for your time, and we'll hand back to Sarah.